Now when Jesus saw great crowds around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. A scribe then approached him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Another of his disciples said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus said to him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. A windstorm arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. And they went and woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. They were amazed and said, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?"
So do you remember how frustrating it was growing up playing sports? How you'd play for a different coach every year, and one coach would prioritize one thing and another thing. Maybe you don't have to remember, maybe you're living that right now if you're in middle school or high school in the sports thing. And sometimes I think it builds resilience and adaptability, but sometimes it's just confusing. Like I remember when I was in 7th grade, my basketball in Laurel was a school sport by 7th grade. My coach's name was Roger. Turns out he was a Class C state champion head coach from a different life who worked in the business department in Laurel, and so they gave him the 7th grade basketball gig. And Roger, it's one of those in hindsight things, like Roger was just salt of the earth kind of guy. And his priority was like hustle. We practiced blocking out a lot, rebounding, defense, very little emphasis on three-pointers or things like that. I mean, I think his whole game strategy was if we work harder than everybody else, if we hustle more than everybody else, if we rebound well, then the points will follow. And he was really fun to play for. Actually, playing for him in 7th grade, I got some award from him at the end of the year that kind of celebrated my role on the team, and that was affirming. That summer, I grew 6 inches. So in 8th grade, I went from a guard to, a power forward. But that coach in 8th grade, his name was Mr. McKinney, and he's a great guy, good coach. But his priority, it was completely different. He was a three-point guy. He wanted guys who could dribble the ball between their legs and kind of look the part of a basketball player. And so I had a fine year because it turns out 8th graders don't shoot threes very well, so I was just the guy in the blocks that rebounded lots of bricks and put a lot of shots up from 2 feet away. But then Mr. McKinney, he followed us, our class, and he became the freshman coach my freshman year, and the varsity coach, who actually grew up with his son, spent a lot of time at his house growing up. So I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by this, but the varsity coach, his priority was three-pointing, like three-point shooting. He literally wanted 5 guys on the court who could shoot threes, and I think his assumption was, I can teach defense, I can teach rebounding, but I can't necessarily make up for lost time when it comes to shooting threes. And my freshman year was my last year of basketball, for more than one reason. But do you remember that feeling? Like maybe you've had it at work. You had one boss, and then you got a new boss, and suddenly the standards changed. Maybe sometimes you feel that in different relationships where it's just this moving target all the time. Last week we started into Matthew 8, and we just used that kind of idea of this exhausting, like, okay, what's the standard? What do you want from me? To really speak into the gospel according to Matthew. Because what we observed last week was this can happen to us as we think about God and Jesus. It's happened to all of us. And again, I don't think it's all bad, but think of the number of churches that you've been a part of, the number of mentors that you've had, the number of different caricatures that are out there, the different seasons where different points of view about God have influenced you differently. And I think where that can get confusing, and I think for me why I'm finding this Matthew series so cathartic is just there's this opportunity to kind of still as many voices as we can. And sure, we can't read anything without some kind of bias, but to still as many voices as we can and listen to this 2,000-year-old account of Jesus and the life that he lived. And again, I get it. Matthew brings his own lens, and I bring mine as I try to make sense of Matthew. But I really think that what Matthew's doing in the 8th chapter, and if you haven't followed us through this series, he starts by, there's this great emphasis on Jesus as Messiah, and you get to choose what kingdom you live in. And then in Matthew 5 through 7, Jesus' longest recorded sermon, we call it the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus really builds out like, here's the heart, here's the character of the person who lives in my kingdom. And there's this sense of like, okay, what's left to talk about? Why isn't Matthew just 7 chapters long, or at least 8? And then we'll talk about the resurrection and boom. But in 8, it seems like what Jesus is starting to do and what the author Matthew's starting to do, and I can't claim to perfectly understand how they're working in concert all the time, but the priority seems to be beginning to give voice to, like, how does Jesus want us to believe? How does Jesus want to define what it means to have faith in him? Like, what are his priorities for us? And we explored last week 3 stories, a story of a leper and a centurion, and then Peter's mother-in-law. And I suppose there's more you could observe, but to me, the 2 big things are, first of all, faith for Jesus is always a team sport. In all 3 cases, he healed these people, and he drew them into community. Like the Jewish metaphor for the end of this age was this great banquet. And it seems to be a way of saying that the banquet's not a series of tables for one, and it's not even a series of tables in a banquet hall for single-family dwellings. It's a banquet table for everybody, and faith in Jesus' context always seems to be a team sport. The other thing that we observed last week is just this idea of moxie or chutzpah, that the centurion, the leper, there's probably lots of theological points that they didn't have full understanding of, but one thing they did was they knew that to have faith was to be all in on the character of who Jesus was, not unlike a marriage. Marriage is, it's betting on the character of the other person, which frankly doesn't always work out, but that's the difference between covenant and contract. And faith is, it seems like Jesus is saying before it's any of these other theological tenets, it's this confidence, this bravado we have this incredible confidence in who Jesus is. And at times it comes across as bravado or moxie because we're just, as my friend Brian Hopkins used to say, we're operating like a trapeze artist without a safety net. Like the safety net is the character of God. What happens here, though, and what Chris just read, I've been fascinated by for a couple months because it looks like it could be a transition to a new topic. Let's just look again back at 18. It says, now, when Jesus saw the great crowds around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side. And I think for me, this has been one of the reasons why it's so helpful to read in context, because the question could be, so is that a chronological statement? Like, is that just a statement of geography? Is Matthew just doing the things that the gospel writers sometimes do and authors often do? Is it just a transition statement? Okay, we did this lesson on faith, and now we're moving on to the other thing, and we don't yet know what the new thing is. Is that what's happening here? Well, there's some stories that would lend themselves to say maybe it's not. Because the next story is this guy comes up to Jesus and says, I want to follow you. Remember, what I'm suggesting is the story is about faith. And Jesus says, okay, well, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Now, what's going on there? Well, what we know from the historical context is that Herod the Great, was frequently referred to as a fox. Of course, by this time, it's his sons that are in power up over a divided kingdom. They too were known as foxes. Why? Because they're cunning, they're slippery, and as I understand it, they have nice dens. The Herods had all those things. It was a way of speaking to the Herod. He's Herod the fox, they would say. Well, what's with the birds? What's going on there? Well, what we know is that a Roman army, when it entered town, when it moved into battle, the head guy would be holding, I forget what they're called, but a pole with an aquila on the top. And here's actually a picture of something like what they would have carried. The symbol of the Roman army was the eagle. Aquila means eagle. These things, not only did they come with prestige, if you carried them, they had religious power. I read one story this week where an army lost one in the forest in Europe, and Rome spent 2 decades trying to re-find it. They had this great power. And the symbol to the Jewish people of the Roman army and their luxury was the eagle. So what's Jesus saying here? Well, another guy says, I want to follow you, but first let me bury my father. And Jesus says, well, let the dead bury their own dead. Now, this one for me is a little bit harder to suss out. It's a little bit less clear exactly what's going on. What we know is the Jewish culture, probably not unlike the way we imagine Egyptian culture, that their burial rituals were incredibly important. There were certain things you did on certain days and you didn't interrupt them. So it's possible this guy's father is on his deathbed. It's possible he's already died. To me, what seems most likely is really what he's saying here is, hey, my dad's getting old. He's going to die soon. When he does, I'm going to get an inheritance, at which point I'm going to retire, and then I'm going to give the rest of my life to following you. And Jesus kind of takes exception to it. What's going on here? What is he trying to communicate to these guys? Well, look at the next line. Again, if you're reading in a modern Bible, it breaks these up, but I just wonder if that's the intent. Verse 23, and when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. Now, here's my question. Is this one of those chicken and the egg kind of things? Like, were his disciples because they followed him, or because they were disciples, they followed him? Like, which order did it happen in? Is it that those who actually got in the boat that went proved to be his disciples, or was it that those who proved to be his disciples actually followed him? It's kind of twisted. It reminds me of a mentor I had in my 20s, who is probably towards my later 20s. There was a moment where I just had enough self-awareness to thank him for all that he'd poured into me. And his line, it was very flattering. I'm not convinced it was entirely true, but I think there's something true to what he was saying. He said, Adam, if you wouldn't have found me, you would have found somebody else. And then he said, because disciples pick themselves. Now, it's a little bit uncomfortable because he's talking about me, but I think there's something to the principle, and maybe we see it here. Like, Jesus still hasn't really defined, the gospel hasn't really defined who are the crowds and who are the disciples. We know that there's somewhat of an inner circle because he frequently addresses the disciples. But who are they? And could it be that in this instance, what's going on here is they're not chronological markers, they're not geographical markers, they're not transition statements that an author would make. Could it be that Jesus is continuing to define faith? And could it be that for Jesus, faith has something to do with having confidence in God and then following him to really uncomfortable places, following him to serve people in ways that you never imagined serving people? Like, what's the other side? It's not just a geographical marker. We know this, and we've talked about this in the past. Maybe you've not studied it, but the other side, it's a Gentile side. It's a non-Jewish side. It's a side that's represented by a whole culture and a whole way of life and a whole way of worship that couldn't be more different than Jesus. Remember, even Jesus tells a parable one time about a particularly rebellious son, and that son went to the other side. It captures everything that's unholy to the Jewish people. Good Jewish girls and boys didn't go to the other side. And Jesus says, hey, we're going to go to the other side. Could it be that Jesus is, in fact, teaching a lesson about faith, that he's continuing to talk not in these complicated theological ideas, but in these ways that impact how we live? Could it be that faith is more about responsibility than it is privilege? And what continues that line of thinking for me is even the way they crossed. We know, and I've made this joke before, but I learned early on in Helena, I have no interest in Canyon Ferry because I lived here for about 2 years before I realized every one of you has your like, I almost died on Canyon Ferry story. Because there's these infamous storms, and I have multiple friends who have, like, I feel like everybody who I know owns a boat. Like, yeah, I beached it at one time on Canyon Ferry. The storm came up, and man, waves are higher than my head, and I'm like, that's why I ride a bike, because I can roll home. That's the context, and I won't get into the reality of what happens on the Sea of Galilee, but it's very similar. What we know is to the extent that a person would cross the other side, a Jewish person, they wouldn't cut across the short way as the bird flies. They would, at the very least, they would follow the perimeter. They'd go north or they'd go south, and it'd be like walking along the edge of a cliff, one hand kind of on the shore and the other one committed to making this trek. It's not the way they go. They cut straight across the sea. And then there's this decisive thing, there's this moment, because a storm hits, of course, and this is like for those of us that are pessimists or whatever, it's like, see, this is exactly why I don't do this. And by the way, for the Jewish people, the sea is the abyss. It represents everything chaotic. Even today, I've been to the Sea of Galilee twice, and I've never seen water skis. I've never seen a jet ski. I mean, it looks like Hauser Lake. It looks like Flathead Lake. It's this beautiful lake. But even still to this day, as I understand it, for the Jewish people, water is this abyss. It's scary. It's the unknown. It's chaos. Look at Genesis 1. They go directly across, a storm hits, and Jesus says, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" You of little faith is a phrase that Matthew uses 4 times in his gospel. The first time is in the Sermon on the Mount when speaking to his disciples. He says in 6:30, "But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you?" And here's the phrase, "You of little faith." Question, what's the issue here? What's the focus? Where's the heat? What's Jesus addressing? Does it not have something to do with God's provision in the future? The second story is the story we're currently looking at in Matthew 8. They're crossing the sea, but are they dead? Well, dumb question. No, they're not. They're in a storm, but what gets them in trouble here? Is it not a preoccupation with the future? Third story where Jesus looks at them and calls out little faith. It's when Peter's walking on the water. It's Matthew's version of Peter walking on the water. And some of you may recall, Peter's doing just fine. And all of a sudden, and it seems like, again, it's a futuristic thought, all of a sudden, something distracts him. He starts falling in the water, and do you remember Jesus' refrain? He says, "Why did you doubt, you of little faith?" The fourth time he uses this phrase, they're again in a boat. This time they're again on water, they're crossing water, and he looks at his disciples and he says, "Be careful of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Now, in the Jewish world, yeast is it's almost always, I can think of one instance where Jesus uses yeast for a positive sense, but it's almost always a marker of sin. Remember, when the Jews celebrated Passover, part of that whole festival was you eliminated all the yeast from your house. You ate unleavened bread, because yeast is this beautiful illustration of sin, because it captures that it can start small, but it takes over the whole thing. So he says to them, "Be careful of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." And the disciples start going like, "Oh, crap, we forgot to bring food." And Jesus goes, "What?" By this point, he's multiplied bread and fed thousands. And there's this point of indignation. And he goes, "What? Like, why are you worried about what you're going to eat, you of little faith?" What's going on here? And could it be that faith leads us beyond what's comfortable, leads us to serve people in uncomfortable ways, and what gets us in trouble is a preoccupation with the future? The last time I studied this verse out for myself, because if you kind of know my method or care, I just have this passion that I want to be in it months ahead of you all. I want to teach out of kind of what I've experienced. And so I studied this personally, this story, for the last time on June 5th. I know that because I looked back at my Evernote kind of half journal, half study notes, and it was June 5th. And I ended my study in my own journal writing this question. Go ahead to that slide, Anna. I just wrote myself this question: what are the things in my life where faith is required? And maybe there's a chance for you to ask yourself, like, where's the heat? What are the instances that maybe it feels like you're trivializing the disciples and this call to the other side, but what are the instances where it's just like you have this sense God is leading you into some unfamiliar, scary territory? For the sake of illustration, I had 2 answers for myself at the time. The first one, go ahead to that next slide, is and I'm just giving you a quote from my own study thing: "Trusting God to lead us through the next season of being a church, especially as we explore what it looks like to get more Christ-centered." And if you've been around for the last year and a half, you know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't, you don't. And I'm going to speak as clearly as I know how next week to this idea of how are we going to turn this corner, because it feels like we need to turn a corner, and we are turning a corner. The second thing I wrote, it was actually the first, I've inverted them, was this statement. Go ahead to that next slide. Frankly, it was hiring a new musician and student person. Obviously, we were in this hiring season. June 5th was fairly early into it, but long enough to know that this would take some work from God. Let's give you the timeline here. 2 weeks later, so I actually looked back, June 5th was a Saturday. Not quite 2 weeks, on Thursday, 2 weeks later, so what would that have been? The 17th, I believe. There was some mounting tension in me, especially because I was scheduled to be gone the next week with my wife for anniversary, and so I knew there was going to be this week where I wasn't getting anything done. And so we were deep into the hiring process at this point. And I just want to be clear, we had candidates, we had good candidates, and yet frankly, nothing felt like the candidate. And I hit my low on that Thursday, if I'm being honest. I'm an Enneagram 1, so when I start getting unhealthy, I move to a 4, which basically means I just feel sorry for myself. And I was fully in this kind of self-loathing place. And that morning, I sent a text to some friends who were involved in the hiring process with me, and I just said, boy, I think we're about to figure out whether or not this thing called Narrate is a work of our flesh or whether God is with us. Because what was becoming clear to me is we needed a miracle as it came to making a hire. Like I just had this sense that we needed to hire really young, really talented, really ambitious, someone who there was lots of get to in the opportunity to go take lessons from David Casey and grow in that respect. It seemed really clear that our student game, we really needed to come alongside people like the Bilyus and the Durgas and Jelena who were serving students and give more support and kind of scale what they were doing. And it just, frankly, it didn't feel great. I'd cast the net as wide as I know how. I'd talked to recruiters. We had some good conversations locally. I'd made contact with probably 40 or 50 people from my own network over the years, scattered across the country. And what I learned was what's happening nationally in the job front is happening in churches. And there's never been more people leaving ministry. In fact, I just was told last week in the association of churches that we're a part of, the leader of that group has said that a year from now, he estimates half the pastors will no longer be pastors. So it's just a tricky, tough season. That night I went and met with, there's a group of guys that we've just kind of been praying for one another through the season. We met, and I did my Enneagram 4 self-loathing kind of thing. And I remember one friend said, like, well, Adam, and I kind of gave him the same line, like, we got to figure out whether or not God is with us because we need a miracle. And one of my friends said, well, it sounds like you're kind of putting a fleece out there. I was like, well, I think that's true, but I also don't think Gideon was supposed to do that. Like, I'm not convinced that story reflects well on Gideon. Next morning, in fact, one of my friends actually, he refers to that text I sent as my prayer of lament, which I think is actually a pretty good term. Next morning, I was walking to the office, and my phone habits during this season were horrid. Like, there's just no other way to say it. I kind of pride myself in not staring at my phone, but I'm not kidding. I was checking my email sometimes every 10 minutes because I'm waiting for Indeed. I mean, just the net was cast wide. I was just waiting for something. And as I was walking to the office on a Friday morning, I looked at my phone, and there was this application that came in from this person named Avery, and I clicked on it as much as you can on your phone, and I'm that guy crossing 11th Street staring at my phone. And I saw enough of her resume to go like, oh, okay, well, this is somewhat intriguing. I got to the office. We had a meeting as a staff, our last kind of Friday planning meeting for Sunday. Got done with the meeting, went back to the office, and then I did what you do. You pull up Facebook, right? And you go to YouTube. And in my case, I'm like, I want to see this person leading music. I want to hear it. I want to see her. And I was intrigued, and I still can remember. I grabbed my computer, and I ran into Hannah's office, and I was like, what do you think? And then I ran into Justice's office, and like, what do you think? And I sent a text with some videos to the council and some of these people who were helping. And by about 11:30 that morning, because patience is a problem for me, I had texted her, and I said, hey, I'd love to talk. And about a half hour later, she came back, and she said something about, like, is this Chris from somewhere else? And I remember I read that to Justin, and I said, we're about to find out her sense of humor. Because I texted back, and I said, no, Chris said you should talk to Adam about Helena. Because I knew at that point Chris was also trying to hire her. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Hannah and I had a phone conversation with her on the phone. That was fun. And then, of course, there's this point where it's like, you just got to get him out here. Again, I'm not trying to make this about me or even Avery, but I'm trying to make it about what is faith? And what is it that God asks for us? And could it be that image of a trapeze artist minus the net is actually part of the story? Now, it was a long time later before I got to hear Avery's side of the story, but I thought I was going to tell it this week, and then I was like, well, that's kind of self-absorbed. Maybe I'll let her tell the story. So I'm going to come on up here, Avery. I just thought there's this moment where someone actually challenged her in her own kind of cross-the-sea moment that I thought you'd enjoy hearing from her. So go ahead.
Now I'm on. Great. Actually, the guy was from Oklahoma City, so it was even better because I was like, oh, yeah, I'd applied to this guy in Oklahoma City, and so totally thought that's who he was. And I do have a sense of humor, thank the Lord, so that was great. But, yeah, I had been job searching, I'd say 8 months to a year. I'd been through a really rough season. I was in the, season of selling insurance and going through college, and I hated insurance. I hated selling it, and it's great, but we all know it's just needed, and I just didn't like pushing people. It just wasn't who I was, and I just didn't like it. And so I had been applying regionally, locally, all through Oklahoma City, through, surrounding cities in Oklahoma City, and I just, couldn't get a bite, on anything. And so I went to my worship pastor at the time, his name was John, and I said, John, I was like, I don't understand. I've had this call to be in ministry since I was 15, and I just feel like I'm not getting anything. I don't understand why, I've been putting in the work. I've been doing the college that I don't want to do. I've been, leading on every Sunday and Wednesday for the last 6 years. I don't understand why I can't get anything. And he looked at me and he said, well, Avery, I just feel like you are just dipping your toe in the water and you're not fully stepping out of the boat. And I was like, what are you talking about? No, I had been applying everywhere, Kansas, Texas, Arkansas. I had just been everywhere. And he said, well, why don't you just, I'm in his house that one night and him and his wife were there. And he said, why don't you just search, if you're that confident in who God is and what God has for your life, why don't you just go online and worship Pastor United States? And I was like, well, it feels really insensitive to God's character and his plan for my life. And I feel like I shouldn't do that, And he's like, well, just pray about it, think about it. And I was like, fine, whatever. So I went online. It would have been that Thursday evening. And I went online and I searched Worship Pastor United States. And the only reason why I clicked on Narrates was because they actually had the beliefs in the description of the job, which is so funny to me because if you've ever, gone through the hiring process, specifically with churches, they'll make you go to their website and look through all this other stuff. And I was just like, not that that's inconvenient necessarily, but I want to know what you believe before I even send in my application. So that kind of was how it happened, and I applied, and Adam called me the next day. So pretty crazy.
Thanks. What's the winter like in Texas, Oklahoma? I'm sorry.
What?
Oh, I'm just kidding. Just thinking, there's a theme to the lack of winter to those places. I think it's consistent with, I know some of you have been challenged on even just prayer in this season. It's crazy that, yeah. But this isn't about me. I'm trying to ask this question, where's the heat for you? And I actually said there's two parts of that, you have little faith, that stand out to me. The first is this focus on the future. The second one that I think might have just as much value is every time Jesus says it, he says it to his disciples. It's never a blanket statement to people. It's never a blanket statement to his enemies. It's always to his disciples. And then here's the part that I love, that I really think, as N.T. Wright says, the Bible that we have is the one God wanted us to have, and it has human authors. There's a secondary question for me of why did he retain that information? Here you have a guy who's writing the story, and we could debate when he wrote the story, years, decades, whatever, after Jesus died and rose again, but why would Matthew retain what is frankly a pretty unflattering detail about his faith journey? The number of times in which he had to be confronted by Jesus on his little faith. And it makes me wonder if that's not an intentional mark on the Spirit of God's part, if it's not empathetic, compassionate, that God's not unaware of the fact that faith can be difficult. If he's very clear on the fact that just a little bit on our part can move God a whole bunch on his. It reminds me, I had this experience when I was 20 years old with an aunt of mine, and I remember she came up to me at some kind of family gathering, and she said the things that people say to 20-year-olds, and she said, Adam, what are you going to do with your life? And then she caught herself, and she said, don't answer the question. It's a stupid question. None of us knew what we were going to do with our lives when we were 20, and if any of us 30-somethings tell you we did, they were lying. And then I don't remember the exact details of what she said, but it had something to do with stay out of debt. I know she would have said that. Just keep following God. She knew I was on this track. Be faithful. Take advantage of whatever opportunities. Walk through any doors. Stuff like that. And I've retained that my whole life because I think it's a brilliant expose, but I also love the humility that she was able to remember. That those are hard days, and none of us necessarily know. Well, what if that's what God's doing here? Is just affirming that his best and brightest, his Hall of Famers, those who wear the gold jacket, those that we celebrate in all kinds of ways, when they were really in the throes of it, their faith felt this big. So where's the heat? one more question. And I heard this from a spiritual director, and I actually put the podcast, right, the sermon that I heard this from, because I thought it was just one of the best questions I've ever heard. I wish I could have it etched into my retina. He asked this question. He said, have you ever noticed that God is rarely in your imagined future? Now, I've talked to people who don't relate to this, one of them being my wife, which confirmed to me that my wife is a secret spiritual giant. She's like, that's the only way I get through life is knowing that God's in my future. And I was like, well, not me. But maybe you can relate to this. You ever notice that when you get all wrapped up, when you get all worried, when you start thinking about wherever the heat is, whether it's like whether or not your business is viable, or whether or not you'll even enjoy your life 10 years from now, or whether or not you'll actually meet somebody, or about your kids, or about your kids' future, have you ever noticed that oftentimes when we're thinking about the future, that we leave the God variable out? We leave the dependence variable out. So where's the heat for you? And then the questions that I think, and as the band comes forward, we're going to sing and give you a chance to take communion. You guys can come back up here now, but we can even break it down, I think, a few more steps, and this was helpful to me. 3 questions, and again, these are on the mind map. What am I afraid of? What can I do about it? And what do I need to trust God for? And I wonder if one of the clear markers of difference between those trying to follow Jesus and those not is that there's always going to be that third variable. That part of the commitment to believing that we live in an enchanted world where there's more to it than what we get, and I think part of what I want to speak to next week is I've just lost my hope in what I would call like secular humanism, that we solve our problems with what we have in this room and in these people. That part of the faith journey God calls us to is to factor him into it. So where's the heat? And what might it do to just lean in this morning to a God who knows that faith is a struggle and yet also wants to be trusted with the present? Lord God, thanks that you do lead us, and thanks also that you're patient with us when when we're not doing a good job of trusting that you are. But God, would you mark us as people of faith and identify those moments that are just those moments of what am I afraid of, and what can I do about it, and what ultimately do I have to trust you for? We love you, God. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.